Hello, I'm here with Liz and Caitlin on the only podcast you're going to find with nothing about the stupid balloon. But we
Actually, Sam, if you want to talk about the balloon,
I'm sure you're going to. I knew you would, of course, have to ruin it.
yes. In fact, I will tell everyone what the balloon was, because I recognize the technology on the balloon. There have been a few.
Actually, you know something about the technology on
Yeah,
the balloon?
yes. I've
That's
seen it before.
interesting.
Yeah, I've seen it before. So, a bunch of um, uh, companies are trying to look into using balloons to sort of replace cell phone towers. And I've seen that similar design like fly over Japan and a few other countries in the past. And this is because, I'm in the aerospace sphere of knowledge. And I mean, obviously I haven't seen it up close, so I can't confirm, but just the way it looked, the size, the solar panels, it looked very reminiscent of these sort of communication test beds that, a couple private companies are putting up there. It is, I can almost assure you, it is not a spy satellite.
Wow.
You
So the
know,
Chinese are just trying to donate cell service to us as a humanitarian gesture.
as far as I can tell, my best guess is that the balloon was put up by a private company, private individual, and then it floated overhead. They were just testing out, the communications technology. It went into the upper atmosphere, like very high up into the stratosphere, where it drifted over Canada and then finally over the United States, just through the air currents. And at that point, it was, in the United States airspace. And we technically have authority over what's in our airspace. And this isn't the first balloon to have flown over America airspace from another country that, even China.
So you're actually believing their explanation it was a mistake.
I'm not saying it was a mistake, but what I'm saying is it likely wasn't. I have no reason to believe it was military in nature.
Well, it
Especially,
definitely have a take on the balloon that you're not going to hear anywhere else. That's for sure.
yes. So, anyways, yeah. I mean, I wish I had photographs, but yeah, no, it does look like a standard like communications test bed, like they were for cell phones, just using balloons essentially, and so the story just got out of hand. And people are saying, oh, it's a spy thing. And the thing that people have to remember is that China has satellites already in space. There's Google Earth. If they want to see what our military installations look like over Montana, they don't have to send up a balloon.
Soon they're going to recover the pieces from the sea. And then I'm sure our military and media will give us a nice, clear, reliable explanation.
What I imagine happened is that the military people did surveying of it and probably came to the same realization that I did. But all that information is classified because they're obviously doing, intel work, trying to figure out what this balloon is. So they couldn't tell the public it's nothing. And so, and then the one, I guess there was a group of people trying to criticize Biden, and they're like, you should be shooting down the Chinese quote unquote spy balloon. And Biden can't come out and say it's not a spy balloon, So he decided, as far as I can tell, like he just decided to have some fun with it. And then instead of just like pointing a laser to pop the balloon, they decided to like send up a F.
Well, from what I hear, you actually need quite a lot of holes to bring the thing down.
Well, yeah, but they basically shot it with a missile, which was a fine exercise to test the missile and everything like that. And then Joe Biden got out with his aviator sunglasses and was like, "Yeah, we shot down the balloon." It's military action. Oh yeah. So as far as I can tell, the whole thing was just a public. There's no threat to any. There is no threat to our, security. And it ended up just being a way for, the Republicans initially to sort of jab at Biden and do some very irresponsible messaging. They were telling people to take pot shots at the balloon, which is extremely irresponsible. But then it was over our airspace and we can shoot down all we want, that balloon. So Biden called up the, F-22s.
But not with consumer artillery.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Don't you yeah. So anyway, so it just became a media circus thing, and Biden then strolled out with his aviator glasses, and it was very cute and very fun. But there was absolutely no way this was a spy satellite.
well, I tend to agree with you. It's not any serious spy value, but I guess we may learn some more about it in the future.
But we know now that the F-22 works. It's functional. It was worth all of those billions of dollars that we
Yep.
spent on it.
Yeah,
Well,
we got to shot down a balloon.
if the enemy is riding balloons, yes. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, we also have AI teachers, which make more sense than the balloon. But anyway, first, Caitlin has got more information about Netflix.
Yeah, so Netflix is doing something very silly. They are, for a while now, they've been talking about going after account sharing, and they are going to start doing it pretty soon. But the thing is that once they start cracking down on account sharing, the total number of people on Netflix is going to go way down. So this is kind of, I don't see how this is going to help Netflix in the long run, because I know that they want to grow, and they're sort of running out of room to grow. But at the same time, there's a certain amount of assets to having as many people as possible viewing your content.
Well, especially now they're putting ads in it.
Yeah, exactly. And by doing this whole, ending password sharing, it's going to devalue a lot of the content and a lot of assets that Netflix has. So I kind of don't get the business point of this, other than I think they're trying to just appease investors who want to see Netflix like infinitely grow. But yeah.
Well,
What I find infinitely confusing about this is that don't they already limit it to like 5 devices?
They do. It's very silly. And like I said, they're basically giving up a huge asset that they have in order to, this is just a trend I've seen with a lot of these tech companies, is that they have these assets that are really good to have, but they're willing to throw them all away if it makes their investors happier for like more short-term gains.
Well, it's bizarre too, because from what I read, it's predicated on you having to log on with your device to your home Wi-Fi every 30 days. Well, that's problematic for a number of reasons that I can already see that, you wouldn't really consider edge cases, like people who spend a lot of time on the road. Yeah. What if you have multiple home networks? I mean, I don't know. It's really strange to me.
Well, I think there's a lot of financial pressure for a few reasons. One is that there's so many streaming services. There's clearly too many. People keep telling me about things to watch, and I can't watch any of them because I'm not willing to pay for like 5 streaming services. And they clearly need to thin that out. And so right now they're having trouble for any of them making any money. And in particular, Netflix used to make a ton of money, and their stock has fallen a lot. And people say the quality of their offerings is way down. So people are fleeing to Disney Plus and other alternatives.
Right. And then instead of maintaining the customers that they have, they are sort of pushing out a few that, like, it reminds me of this story I once heard from some game developers who were developing like free MMOs. And they said, how much money should I put, into fixing bugs for free players? And this consultant said, you should put in a lot of money, because those free players are adding value to the service, because it was just every person that's using your thing is an asset to the community of like Netflix users, to the content developers who want to get as many eyes on like new IPs as possible. All these are fantastic assets. And if you are, blocking as many people as possible, it hurts one of Netflix's greatest assets, which is its huge subscriber and viewer base. So,
well, I think this has been going on for at least 20 years. The Recording Industry Association and the MPAA have decided that to make money, they want to tighten the screws and squeeze more money out of their customers and give them less value, rather than this open source model where you appeal to a lot of people and try to get money indirectly. That's certainly and I think Elon Musk is the king of this, right? Cheapen the product and squeeze more money out of the people that love you is his plan to save Twitter.
Right. And yeah, like I said, there's more assets, to a business than just, monetary assets. You have brand recognition, you have, people who are actively using your project, word of mouth, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, it seems to me like a very simple technique, which I think is what they had, is where you just give them like you pay a fee, and then it's like 10% more for each additional IP address or something. So if you have 5 locations, it's cheaper than buy 5 accounts. Anyway, we'll see what comes of it. I know Netflix is in big trouble. Of course, fundamentally, this is the American corporation system where once you go public, you are promising to grow like 3 to 5% a year forever. And another company that's hit a big problem there is Meta. I mean, Facebook got so popular that they had like more than half of all the people on Earth in Facebook, so they can't possibly grow anymore. So they have to move into some other industry. And I remember I've listened to Scott Galloway on this stuff. Like he says, why Amazon has to move into healthcare because they're so big. Healthcare is the only remaining area they could move into that's big enough for them to grow. And
right.
that's the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a fundamental problem with sort of our capitalist system, is this idea that we need infinite growth, that you can't just have a Facebook company with half the world's users on it and then just call it, okay, we're done. They have to continue growing after that. And there's, and it's the investors just require it, and it becomes a big mess.
Well, but I think we are hitting the end of it with the Japanese and Chinese and American population all shrinking. We are being forced to move over the next 20 or 30 years from a constant growth economy to a steady state sustainable economy. We got to move to no more burning fossil fuels and use windmills and stuff. And we got to build a stable society where we're content to just have things kind of stay the same instead of constantly growing. And that's quite a change for us.
Correct. I mean, that's not to say we can't have the total amount of money in our society growing, but the idea that we just have infinite growth in all fields, that's not sustainable.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, I was very excited about this Duolingo article, which I think is in IEEE Spectrum, talking about how to teach people with AI. And, there's this I thought is brilliant because I do a lot of gamified learning. We all do. CTFs are the standard for security people to learn because playing a fun game with competition is so much better than reading a textbook and watching a lecture and doing canned homework assignments. And Duolingo, I didn't realize it. I've heard of it. Duolingo is where you learn a language. They tried to make this work with AI. They said, we have these language, you're trying to learn a language like Spanish, and it has these lessons and challenge questions. And so they tried the model from the Khan Academy, where they teach you one thing and make you practice it a bunch of times to prove you learn it before going on to the next one. And they discovered that for language, that is not really appropriate the way it is for math, because language is not so cut and dried, where you must understand concept A before you can move on to concept B. But they did make an AI which records everything you do, whether you got it right or wrong, and it uses that to train you on what your level of proficiency is and also how difficult the questions are. And they tried to use learning theory so how many times, how hard should we make it? How often should a person succeed to keep them motivated? If you make it too easy, they're having a lot of fun, but they're not learning. If you make it too hard, they don't succeed and they get all frustrated and quit. This is exactly what we all face in class. What is the sweet spot of difficult enough to keep you progressing, but not too challenging? And they have sophisticated AI algorithms for this. And they talk about how they handle the memory and the storage for it all. And it just seems brilliant. I think this is a brilliant thing. I think there's a huge future in this in almost every part of education, having AI assisting your gamified learning to keep it at the right level. And like 40 years ago or 30 years ago, I did this actually. I was doing psychometry at the time, which is measuring human perception. Things like what is the dimmest light you can see. And the old fashioned way of measuring that is to have like 5 levels of light and do like 100 trials of each one and draw the curve. And there's a much faster algorithm that takes each single answer and decides what the best challenge is for the next light level and the next light level. And it can zero in on the answer in like 10 trials instead of several hundred. It's the same thing, how do you, and the modern certification exams work this way too. They don't ask you like 500 questions. They ask you like questions, and then they decide how easy that question was and whether you got it right, and ask you a harder question until you get them wrong, and then make it easier until you're getting them right. And after a few cycles up and down, they know how much you know without having to ask you so much. So I think this is a great idea, and I hope more products develop it, and hope we get an open source version of it we can all start using in our classes. Anyway, then Liz has got more about the layoffs.
This was an interesting story that ran in, of all places, Business Insider, which really surprised me.
I see a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, so do I. I just was really especially surprised to see this article, which was titled Silicon Valley needs to stop laying off workers and start firing CEOs. Little bit at odds with their usual publication fare, but it was a good read. It's kind of interesting in that, you know, we've had a lot of discussion about you know, the reasons for these mass firings and layoffs at large tech companies, and typically everyone says, well, it's the economy, we're in a downturn, we're in a recession. That's true, but it definitely doesn't take into account a lot of the business decisions that have been made over the past few years, and the way that those business decisions ultimately impact and bring about these layoffs. Because you know, it's kind of like what Kalen was talking about before. You know, this in many cases is strongly tied to appeasing investors. In some cases, you know, the companies that are laying people off are still paying pretty good dividends, or acquiring new assets. Salesforce is a good example. They acquired Slack, what, a year or two ago, and for like, I don't know, $27 billion, something like that, and just laid off like 10% of their workforce. So it's not necessarily just due to the sort of standard issue economic hardship that we think is plaguing every industry right now. Some of these things are due to actual decision making that has taken place by very highly compensated humans.
Yeah, you know, I read these articles I talked about over the last few weeks. I'm very skeptical about these layoffs. You know, they just hired a ton of people, like doubling the size of companies in the last 2 years. Now they're going to lay off 10%. I'm sure next year they'll hire another 20%. I wonder if you actually accomplish anything with these layoffs. Business goes up and down. You'll want those people back before long, and it really messes people up. I've seen articles saying, oh, tech people are in such demand, they don't mind getting laid off. I don't believe that's true. I meet students that have been laid off. It seems to me to be just as hard on tech workers as anyone else when they get laid off. It throws their life into turmoil, and it is not easy to recover. And it's just not necessary. The business will come back up. You're going to want the people back. And if you actually had loyal people that loved your company, instead of like random people that expect to get fired again pretty soon, it would probably be better.
Well, it was interesting. The outlier in this article was Apple, who actually cut costs without layoffs. One of the ways they did that was by reducing Tim Cook's salary to a meager $49 million a year. How can anyone live on that? I also might add that Tim Cook is getting paid less than the CEO of PG&E.
Yeah.
Which that's a whole nother discussion. But
well, that's government. And as we know, government is the most corrupt.
Yeah.
With the old-fashioned model where the people on top just want to dance the minuet and throw extravagant parties and steal all the money from the peasants to do that.
But it is interesting to note that, you know, not everybody's doing that. Apple being one of the titans of tech, the tech industry, actually managed to avoid implementing layoffs by you know, taking sensible measures with executive compensation. So,
well, this is what the business articles I read said. They said if you need to cut costs, it'd be far better to just cut pay, and when you do it, be sure to cut the top executives' pay more than the lower workers, and then people will accept it, saying we all have to tighten our belt, and that's much less traumatic for the company and the employees than layoffs. You say, well, you get a pay cut, but you know, when business comes back, it'll come back up, but you still have a job. So you don't have to like panic and move and sell your house. And
well, and then you have a sort of a chicken and egg problem too, where, you know, obviously it's not a business, but I look at the college as an example where yes, you can cut these positions and you can shrink your workforce, but then you leave less of an opportunity for the business to come back because there is nothing in place to serve those potential customers. So you're really shooting yourself in the foot in the long term.
Oh yeah, and as we see in our department with you in particular, I mean, why is anybody teaching at a college anyway? You're making 1/4 of what you could make in the private sector, and they treat you like trash in addition. I mean, the fact is, it's amazing we can get any good teachers at all. And then when you treat them badly, it's clearly self-defeating.
Right.
Tech field. Anyway, all right. So let's go to Caitlin, who has Bard, the hot stuff.
Yeah, so finally, Google is releasing their response to ChatGPT, and it's called Bard. So this is an article from the BBC written by Zoe Kleiman, although I will point out that there is a better blog post by Sundar Pichai.
Yeah, the CEO of Google.
The CEO of Google, yeah. Talking about Bard. So this is essentially I'm sure he didn't actually write this. I'm sure this was his press secretary. But Bard is basically a downgraded version of Lambda that they're going to let anyone use. Lambda is a giant model that's supposedly much better than ChatGPT, at least at creating dialogue that seems real. Now, I don't know how well it writes code. I mean, that was one of the big things about ChatGPT was not that it seems like a human being. It was that it can actually do work for you. Like if you ask it to write your will, it will write your will. If you ask it to write code, it'll write code for you. I mean, you can have it do real work for you. And I don't know how well Bard is going to do that. But that's what's coming out in the next few weeks. So right now it's in testing. So if you are lucky enough to be a beta tester, you can already play around with Bard. But in the next few weeks, it's going to be slowly rolled out to the masses. And presumably it'll eventually get integrated with like Google searches and stuff and a bunch of other Google products. So this is the example on the blog post where there's a Google query of, what new discoveries from James Webb Space Telescope can I tell my 9-year-old about? And it'll, the Bard will sort of give some recommendations. And the reason they use this example is because ChatGPT is based on language models from the internet from circa like 2021. And I guess supposedly the big thing about Bard is that it's going to be continuously updated. So it'll have the newest information.
And it may have the problem, which is the reason they didn't do that with ChatGPT, is that people can poison it with like racist data and such.
Yeah, supposedly Lambda is a very robust model. And the big example of poisoning it was when Microsoft released their chatbot for Twitter a long time ago. And it would just take what people were sending it, and a bunch of racists decided to send it what's it called, like the 12 words or whatever, and telling the chatbot over and over Hitler did nothing wrong until the chatbot reiterated what they were saying. I mean, it was a huge disaster for Microsoft and a good learning experience, for sure. Like it.
Yeah, and this just happened to the Seinfeld. There's a Seinfeld Twitch channel that's playing an endlessly AI-generated version of Seinfeld, but the problem is they were using a free version of, I think, ChatGPT, and the point is it's frequently unavailable, and the one that's available is the earlier version without the safeguards. So eventually, while it was running an earlier version, it started saying awful racist things and got banned.
Yep.
And so that's the problem. You really do have to deal with the weaknesses of AI. Anyway, I was surprised to see this article from sansec.io, a security company I didn't know, but they say this seems to be the next hot security flaw. Like first it was SQL injection. You could steal tons of data. And then it was Amazon buckets that you could leak data. And now it turns out that a whole bunch of people will make backups of their data. They'll just make a predictable file name like database.backup and save it on a public web server with no protection. They found 12% of stores they were able to find these by just doing a brute force search with a list of common names. And they say there are bots already out there doing this attack. They're just looking for like hundreds and thousands of common possible backup names and finding backup databases just sitting on web servers frequently. So I'm amazed that people would do this, but it is apparently a common practice. And a thing to be aware of, make sure that none of your developers are putting confidential data on public servers with no protection. But, this keeps happening one way and another. That's the latest problem. Anyway, then Liz has got more about Android phones.
Well, in a article from the Register covering some security research that a couple of academics did through University of Edinburgh and Trinity College in Dublin, news that will surprise no one. Androids that you buy in China are stuffed with bloatware that may be transmitting your PII to third-party entities.
Just like Windows laptops you buy in America from like Dell.
Exactly. Well, and I think about all of the bloatware on our phones too, that you buy at the store. I mean, there's really a lot of the time some sketchy stuff going on there where your data is being exfiltrated, tracked, sold to the highest bidder, and so on. But some of this research was pretty interesting, I thought, in that the researchers made some assumptions that sound like a pretty reasonable security policy. They assumed that nobody was using cloud storage or hadn't created accounts on developer platforms or installed any weird apps from unknown providence or anything like that.
Who assumed that?
Pardon?
Who assumed that?
The researchers, when they conducted the research on the phones, because you're going to get a lot of extra. If you didn't assume that, you might get a lot of extra data and be able to find a lot of extra stuff that wouldn't be there just in the factory ready state that they bought the phones in.
Right. So they bought a phone, right? And then didn't put any junk on it and then see if it's sending data off, right?
Right. And didn't sign up and didn't link any accounts to it, didn't connect it to any services or anything like that, so that they could examine the phones from a clean state.
Okay.
And they found that even with those limitations, that they were still sending a ton of PII, not just to the device vendors, but also to third party firmware authors and service providers. And one of the pretty wild things about this, I thought, was that the phones were even transmitting data even when there wasn't a SIM card in the phone.
What kind of data have they got to send in that case?
Well, that's what I wondered. And what they said was the data and they didn't explain the method of transmission, but they said the data we observed being transmitted, it includes persistent device identifiers like IMEI, MAC addresses, etc., location identifiers, user profiles, social connections, stuff like that. So they didn't explain how that happened. I don't know if, and they didn't say anything about network connections in here, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I doubt this is intentional surveillance. I think this is just, network communication protocols designed for maximum efficiency and monitoring performance. That's usually what it is.
Maybe, but then you think about how all of the telecom in China is state-owned.
Well, sure, that's the problem. It could be used for another purpose, but you're right. Yeah. All right, that's the same thing with our hatred of TikTok. We're supposed to ban TikTok because they might use that data. There's no evidence they ever have used it for bad purpose, but they could. Anyway, so let's go back to Caitlin, with layoffs.
Yeah, so we talked about short-sightedness of a lot of these companies trying to appease investors. And one of the big short-sightedness of laying off a bunch of tech workers is that a bunch of startups are gathering up all these talented people who have worked at like Google and Amazon and Facebook, or I should say Meta, and now they're acting as competition, further decreasing their value. So like I said, not all assets a company has is monetary. But a bunch of the investors, that's all they care about are the monetary assets. And so when they dump, a lot of their important assets like human capital, they just get snatched up by the competition.
Yeah, this is the problem with American capitalism. It treats people like they were just replaceable light bulb components and not with any human dignity, which is just not a good model.
Well, now you're just being a socialist. I'm talking about.
I am, of course.
Yes. Now I'm talking more on like a practical level. So there's a few articles. There's one by Nikkei Asia, which unfortunately is paywalled, but basically directly states that the mass layoffs are helping startups get talent. And this was written by Kentaro Takeda and Takeshi Shiraishi. Yep. And then there's another one here by .la about how it's backfiring, about how all the layoffs are backfiring. And this one was written by Samson Amor. But basically, yeah, you fire a bunch of these workers. They get snatched up by your competition. Now, all of a sudden, instead of making a lot of money for yourself, you are, giving your competition all these wonderful assets and people that even with NDAs, they still know a lot of the secrets. They know how your companies work. They know how you're doing things. They know how Amazon's doing things. They know how Google's doing things. They know how Facebook is doing things, and they can blend those things together in a new way that these legacy systems can't possibly, put together. They're just too old and too much built on older technologies. But these new startups, no, they can totally just take the best from all these companies, take the best and brightest that they fired, and integrate it. And it's the short-sightedness of these companies is incredible.
Well, this is the good side of capitalism. If you can avoid letting an emotional reaction cause you to just give up when you get laid off, just move to another company. If a bunch of startups are appearing, then things will be all right. But it's really hard on the people who have a serious blow to their self-worth when they get laid off. Right. If you just say, if you shrug it off and get back up and get another job, then you'll be okay. But that's asking a lot.
Well, it's asking a lot. It's not good for the employees, and it's not good for the business that laid them off. Yeah. It's not good for anyone except for the investors who now see that the amount of money being earned per employee is now higher because they have less employees, but they're still making the same amount of profit. They're not making. It's not that they are now making a profit when they weren't before. It is on paper. It now looks like that company is making more per employee, which is such a short-sighted and myopic way to sort of decide how to run your company.
But well, it is because they just go quarter by quarter, and they do not take into account then when you fire somebody who's worked at the company for 15 years to cut costs, that a lot of institutional knowledge is walking out the door with that employee too. And it's gonna, if you can ever replace that person, it's going to cost a lot of money, time, other resources to be able to replace what that person's contributions. But like you said, it's very myopic and short-sighted. We're not looking past the next quarter on the balance sheet.
Exactly.
Well, some companies, the CEOs don't care about more than a couple of quarters because they're just going to leave with a bill. I certainly like at a college, you have a new chancellor every 6 months or a year, and then they just fire them and have to give them a big payoff to get rid of them. And so they have no incentive to think long term. Anyway, all right. And then I thought this thing is, we've had mentioned this several times previously on the podcast, but this is the first time I actually saw details. Wired magazine has the bold plan to beam solar energy down from space. And they finally talk about the details of it here, which I was very interested to hear. People are doing a serious study of this, and they claim that they will be able to sell this energy at 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And I looked, and the average price of electricity in California is now 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And the nation as a whole is like 26 or something. So 10 cents is seriously competitive. And they're talking about various techniques. One is to put the satellites at the stationary points way out there where they'll never move and stay high in the sky. And the problem with that is you'd have to have a huge satellite to be big enough. And you'd have to have a huge collector on the ground, like a kilometer across, to get the microwaves you're beaming back down. But putting one closer is probably better. And there are various techniques to put them closer, and even have elliptical orbits where they come very close at certain points and have a nest, a group of like 5 or 7 satellites. So there's always one up in the sky to beam down the energy. And they say this will help because, of course, wind and solar farms spend most of their time not generating energy because the sun is not high enough or the wind is not blowing. And if you just got up there, it would be generating more energy 24 hours a day. And apparently, they claim the improvement in that will be enough to pay for the cost. I was originally very skeptical of this, and I still feel that way. I mean, the point is, it's so expensive to put something in space. How can it possibly be worth it compared to just making a bigger thing down here where it's cheap? But they are looking into it, and they claim it may work. So it's part of the European Union's goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we may have these things beaming high power microwaves down energy from satellites.
So one popular orbit for a lot of satellites is called a sun synchronous orbit. And it's hard to explain without diagrams, but essentially the satellite orbit in such a way that it sort of tracks with the position of the sun. And so you always get the same sort of amount of sunlight year round for the satellites. And one thing that you could possibly do, I imagine, is have a sun synchronous orbit, but have it be elliptical. So even when I don't know.
I thought every satellite always had the same amount of sunlight, because if it doesn't get in the shadow of the Earth, it's always at the same distance from the sun.
No, that's not the case at all. The sun synchronous orbits are specifically sort of track the sun as it orbits.
That's a matter of orienting it to follow.
No, it's not. How do I explain this? So there are 2 types of important synchronous orbits. You have, well, three types if you count geosynchronous. So geosynchronous is as far away and it's just always in the same spot in the sky.
Above the equator,
Yeah. And that's very specific. You also have Earth synchronous orbits, which always goes over the same sort of patch of land, day after day after day. So it's, as the Earth rotates, it's synchronized so that it will go over like Arizona once a day, regardless. And sometimes it'll be at midnight. Sometimes it'll be depending on, how the Earth is oriented to the sun. But you also have sun synchronous orbits, which sort of tilt the spacecraft along with the Earth's orbit around the sun. So you get this constant amount of, you don't get constant sunlight, but the amount of sunlight the spacecraft gets is constant throughout the year, if that makes sense. Anyway, so that
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you were to put something like that up, I can almost guarantee it would be in some sort of like sun synchronous orbit. And as far as I know, all sun synchronous orbits are fairly spherical or circular, I should say.
Yeah.
Although I imagine you probably could make a highly elliptical sun synchronous orbit, but I don't know if that actually helped in this case, because you also have to deal with power transmission. And a lot of times, if it is sun synchronous and it's highly elliptical, sometimes that highly elliptical orbit will be in the dark side of the Earth, even though it's sun synchronous, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's why I think they're talking about it. They have these various techniques, but I think the most promising one is to have several satellites, so that none of them is required to always be in the best position, and you move from one to the next as needed. Anyway,
right. For that, I would imagine, they would have a fleet of sun synchronous satellites that would beam down power.
I don't even know why they'd have to be sun synchronous if there's a fleet of them. You just use whichever one is best.
Because you want predictable power generation and delivery. If you're specifically designing satellites to be solar powered, I think that would be a useful thing to have.
I guess. All right. Anyway, and then we got Liz with police sketches made by AI. What could go wrong?
Exactly. What could possibly go wrong? So a new product that leverages OpenAI has been made to and it is called Forensic Sketch AI Artist, which was and these developers created this program to generate police sketches in a fraction of the time that the original hand done ones take, which is about 2 to 3 hours. This thing can just crank them out instantly or nearly instantly. So what could the problem be, you ask?
I'm sure you just get like a generic racist portrayal or something, right?
That's a great guess, because that's exactly what is happening with this thing. It's pretty bad. And one of the issues here is that having these kinds of outcomes doesn't stop us from using this sort of tech at all. In fact, it just kind of fits in hand with how we treat policing in this country in general, profiling and whatnot. So this really acts as a force multiplier for that type of bias, unfortunately.
Well, there's so many startups pitching these magic fake things to police agencies, like Elizabeth Holmes' magic medical thing. Predictive policing, gunshot detectors, license plate readers. There are people promoting all these things as the cure to everything.
And they're buying it too, and it makes you wonder too, if it worked so flawlessly well, how do we still have all of these unsolved freeway shootings?
Well,
They're everywhere.
Well, they hide the data. This just came out yesterday. Fremont is in a huge amount of trouble because of police abuse and police killings. And so they responded last week by shredding all the data that they have on their police shootings before the lawsuit comes in. So they won't have any records, and which is fabulously illegal, at least in civil case. But I know the Daly City Police did the same thing when they shot a guy, Oscar Grant, close to where I lived while I was living there. They shot a guy by grabbing the gun instead of the taser, and the first thing the police did was impound everybody's cell phone, but they didn't get them all. That's why it came out. So it's hiding the evidence is like the first move for police.
How is that not patently illegal? I think that's,
I think
for
it is
criminal cases,
illegal.
doubly so.
I think it is, and it would be nice to see if something is done about it. A lot of illegal things are just not prosecuted mysteriously. But
I guess it's hard to prove too.
Well, this time it seems pretty obvious. They told their staff time to shred all the evidence about police shooting as the investigation is underway, and that is patently illegal. Anyway, so we'll see. But I mean, I think there probably is no hard and fast data about how accurate police sketches are and how often they catch the guy from them.
Well, there is a little bit of data in here that does mention that 25% of wrongful convictions are directly pegged to faulty forensics, including sketches. So,
yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, even eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. That's why we have our justice system, where it's highly weighted in favor of the defendant. So you really have to do a lot of crimes to get arrested. At least that's the idea.
Unreliable witnesses actually, that actually makes this sort of technology even worse, because they can generate a very lifelike image of a person. And then what you get is situations where we've talked about in the past here on the podcast, where you have people getting pinched for crimes that are not were not anywhere even in the vicinity or even remotely involved, but facial recognition software has fingered them as the culprit. So
yep, it's a big problem. A lot of this stuff is being rushed into production use, and it's not ready.
Right.
All right, well, that's it for this one, and we'll be back on Friday.